Hi guys, Beyond Reason, David Stone. So, someone said to me, could you just give a very quick kind of like list, literally a list of those you are trying to uh, critique or deconstruct or undermine, and those who you're using as your source of information or ideas or knowledge. So, I've done it. I've just produced a list of people who've influenced me or continue to influence me, which is a long, long list, and it's only partial. I've left off dozens and dozens of people, but I've also included a list of my kind of like opponents, my targets, if you will. So here's the list of those who I'm mainly going to critique, if not directly by implication in addressing who they are, their ideas, their presence on social media, and their contributions to the current debates. So Andrew Tate, because he's an obnoxious example of toxic masculinity. I have got 5 sons and 3 grandsons, and I don't want them to grow up in a world in which the Andrew Tates set the agenda. Jordan Peterson, because he just talks BS. BS for me is a new term. It's beyond sophistry. Okay, it's associated also with other use, but beyond sophistry, I mean, you take arguments that appear plausible. Once you kind of unpack them just a little bit, do a little bit of investigation, you find they're wanting. Jordan Peterson does things like conflate his attack on Marxism with postmodernism, and which is crazy because postmodernism was itself a critique of rose out of a critique of Marxism. Anyway, he also does this crazy thing about, which is notorious for, this word salad about questioning the meaning of everything. Over emphasis on the importance of symbolism and Jungian archetypes, and this idea that reality is nested within a kind of supernatural environment which can't ever be evidenced. Douglas Murray, I just find he's quite a repulsive character in the sense that he's calm, measured, conservative, but a kind of believer in what I see as hugely corrosive and problematic traditions, mainly out of the UK and Europe, but also the Anglo-Saxon Western traditions. Similarly with Niall Ferguson, who's calm, measured, reasonably well-known historian, but I think his reading of history is just wrong. Ben Shapiro, who's an apologist and a conservative social media person. Candace Owens, don't even get me started with Candace Owens. She just spouts BS all the time. Charlie Kirk, he's passed or was assassinated recently, but his views I found obnoxious. Elon Musk, I mean, the Hitler salute, at a Trump rally, say no more. Tommy Robinson, UK, spinning vile nonsense about the other, particularly Muslims. Donald Trump, I won't go into details there. Milo Yiannopoulos, poisonous person. Kate Hopkins, similarly, obnoxious individuals who I don't, if I'm generous, I don't think they really believe in their own nonsense. Influences, in no particular order. But Marx, even though I don't subscribe to Marxist philosophy, which hang on things like historical or dialectical materialism, I do adhere to Marx's view on alienation and his design of this concept called species being, which is us. I think it's useful, species, as it were, rather than just being a description. Species being is like being an activity, a dynamic process. So I have to acknowledge my indebtedness to Marx, but also to Hegel. Even though Hegel is an idealist, I think his views on dialectics are invaluable. But Lacan for his insights into social psychology, Sartre, existentialism, Heidegger, Stein. I think I'm not Heideggerian, but I think Heidegger was a Nazi. But he had this powerful view that philosophy has to be situated within the way we live. And I kind of agree with that too. And I will later on describe how I see the whole issue around consciousness as being linked to our embodied selves and ourselves within the world and in society and within culture. Hilary Putnam, fantastic philosopher, passed a few years ago, really sorted out the fact-value dichotomy, and to my satisfaction at least, and supports indirectly naive realism, John Searle, which I also kind of support. Merleau Ponty's view out of the 60s, 70s around the importance of the body, which I'll come on to as well. Albert Camus, the myth of Sisyphus, the idea of the absurdity of existence still containing within it the kind of nuggets of value and worth. Richard Rorty, American pragmatist psychologist, but also he linked philosophy to democratic accountability in politics, which I think is really important. Closer to home, David Deutsch, a stunningly powerful exposition of the importance of the scientific method, and a close adherent of Karl Popper. And the main takeaway is that none of this, philosophy or science, is about absolute truth. It's about the best possible explanation for things. And I subscribe very much to that view. David Hume, British empiricist, alongside Locke and Berkeley. Hume, I have huge respect for. I mean, who am I? Because he wrote a lot of these stuff when he was like under 30, and it was mind blowing. But I think his branch of British empiricism lends itself too much to a sceptical perspective, which I don't follow. I don't follow his rejection of the a priori. I don't think that empiricism stands up to close scrutiny, though I think it's a really powerful reminder of the over-dependence on things like induction. Anyway, Hume stands in contrast to someone brought by attention by Dan Robertson. Now, if you have not met Dan Robertson, he's now passed. I think he was a Trump supporter, but he's an American professor of philosophy, and an outstanding presenter of ideas. I mean, just so eloquent, so articulate. And he introduced me to Thomas Reid, a British direct realist who I think really kicks Hume in the nuts, basically, and shows that British empiricism went off the track. As Kant also did the same thing, but Kant tried to develop a synthesis of European rationalism, Leibniz in particular, many other rationalists. I can't think of it just at the moment. Voltaire, but Kant's attempt to synthesize the two, I think, produced some extraordinarily powerful insights about the need for categories of understanding before you can even understand anything. You have to have kind of like ways of understanding, which kind of like knocked the pure sense-based, sensory-dependent empiricists onto the back foot. But he kind of like conceded too much to them, I think, in his declaration that we can't know the noumena or the thing in itself. Bertrand Russell, kind of like, wow, the history of British philosophy, and one of his students, Wittgenstein, critical importance for his views on the language game and the impossibility of a private language. I think this is one of the things I will draw on later on in looking at the poverty of the possessive individualism, which I think is one of the wrong turns we made after the Enlightenment. Now, more up to date, there's lots of people in that, and far too much for you to all hold on to, but Gramsci's views on hegemony, I think, are really powerful. George Lukács is my go-to philosopher for looking at epistemology and ontology, and the kind of like what we can know and what we can infer and what we can speculate about as the axiomatic precondition for knowledge. You have to start somewhere, and Lukács is, for me, the go-to person for setting out how we evolved as a species. And you have to kind of like make some speculation about things like language, like sociability, like collective understanding, like gestures as a proto-language, all of that kind of stuff. Kind of like I depend upon Lukács for. William James, The Varieties of Religious Experience, is an outstanding book. And what it does, it shows you that you can't be too kind of dismissive or glib about faith or belief or religion, because it is what shapes us. I reject the idea that actually is now coming through from current day apologists strongly as part of the kind of resurgence of the right, that the Judeo-Christian mindset actually is the water we all have swum in, and that we owe everything to that, including our current views on morality and sociability and equality. I think that's complete nonsense. But the William James approach, which is to look at the connection between belief and individual and group psychology, is hugely important and very powerful. So then, coming out of kind of like my university days a little bit, I suppose, people like Philippa Foot and R.S. Murdoch, hugely important about the post-war review of the of virtue ethics, ethical dilemmas, and proponents ultimately of objective morality. Raymond Williams, massively influential on culture. E.P. Thompson, the role of the working class in our cultural and social and political history. And then we spin out into like modern, up-to-date people like Dan Dennett for his work on consciousness, and Dan Dennett's kind of saw himself as passed last year, I think, as a compatibilist in terms of the determinist versus free will debate. I mentioned John Searle before, but he's done some extraordinarily good, powerful work on supporting the position of naive realism, which I subscribe to. Michael Sherman is author of Skeptic, and yeah, he's a strong proponent of the scientific method and the need for evidential bases for belief. And I've kind of copied a lot of his stuff. We've got Sam Harris, who I've got very strong mixed views about. I love his stuff on moral objectivity. Don't like his stuff on lack of free will. Don't agree with it. And but he's a very good speaker, very clear, very articulate, very passionate. I think he's not a relativist, a cultural relativist. He's got strong views about where religion goes wrong in terms of permitting or even evoking the need for cruelty between people. But right up to date, like Alex O'Connor was the cosmic skeptic, is now, I think, with within reason. Outstanding, disgustingly young. He started. Outstanding guy. Don't agree with him on most of the stuff he espouses, particularly free will, objectivity, moral objectivity. I think he calls himself an emotivists. I think emotivism is a cop out. I think his critique of religion is great. I think he's sliding into it a little bit with his enchantment with the cosmological argument. Or is it the other one? Is it the argument for design? I can't remember which one it is that he's quite enamoured of. Anyway, he's a great guy. Stephen Woodford, Rationality Rules. Stephen, I've got huge regard for. I think he's best at debunking, just taking very strong positions, evidence-based positions, usually using the analytical method or sometimes I think a little bit off pat use of fallacies to critique people like Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro. Did I mention Ben Shapiro as one of my opponents? Well, if I didn't, I should have done. Where Stephen Woodford falls down is when he tries to be too reasonable with people and he tries to see the other point of view. And I think that's those interviews he has with people who are clearly like apologetics or something. Is not as convincing. There's Joe Foley, who's brilliant. There's Cosmic Skeptic, who's fantastic. These are people in the mix that I go to and admire, and then there are obviously people who you won't know because they're personal to me. But my brothers Simon, Martin, Addy are my go-to people for like testing things out and getting shot down and made to feel like a little child again. My partner Jan, who is my strongest critic, is hugely influential. At university, there were a few people who I still know about who were part of the conversation, but I don't want to mention them because they're still alive and they're still like some are really well known, and I had some really violent disagreements with them, but I respect them. But you probably know who you are. The people who in my current environment, I'm just going to mention a few without going into any detail that I've used to as a kind of like sounding board. So Pauline Yule, Polly is, I've worked with her for about 5 or 6 years now. She's brilliant, very incisive, very smart, but comes from an international development background, so knows stuff that I just don't know about, and has been very generous in sharing with me. Robert Musgrave, key figure in work in Battersea, religious guy, but doesn't kind of like ram it down your throat. I think we probably, if we worked together, would find that we've got some incompatible beliefs, but we get on really well, and he's taught me a huge amount. Tessa Strickland, who's a member of the local church, is an outstanding person. She's conservative, but not in the way that I see conservatism, and she's just a constant like reminder to me of how we need to stay grounded in what we're doing and don't always be off with the kind of like the abstract, the fairies, the kind of like interesting but sometimes just speculative forms of discourse. Wendy Speck is another one of my colleagues at the moment that just keep me grounded. Whereas I'm trying to get things done all the time, she's just very measured, very calm. She's been around the block a little bit, former Labour councillor, been through some hugely traumatic personal disasters recently, but just is so strong, so resourceful, and so committed to kind of the wider community agenda. Um, I can't go without mentioning Charlene. Charlene is my sort of colleague at work, but we have loads of fun discussing ideas and riffing off. In particular, one of my go-tos is this idea of uh, we live in a post-colonial age, and us old white guys, we need to be educated about our own complicity in imperialism and colonialism, and get away from the idea that we know it all. So or that we're the authors of it, or that the agendas is our, we set the agenda, or that the conversations need to be guided by mansplaining everything from this higher perspective. I got also some of that from talking to Jan and Jan's family, and talking to my brother Adi, who's from Nigeria. A really overwhelming sense that for many in the West, the uh, analytic philosophical tradition is not the way to go. We have to be much more pluralistic in how we look at our account of both logic, by the way, and non-logical forms of inference and deduction and debate. So paying attention to philosophy uh, from all sorts of different cultures, from Africa, from China, from India, from um, the diaspora, both the African and the Jewish, and other forms of disconnected communities that have had people or groups articulating experience of working alongside other cultures and other ideas. The melting pot of different views and opinions that come out of Arabia. So Peter Adamson, The History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps, is just a mine of information, and I think he's done something like, as I speak today, he's done something like 450 um, podcasts, all between 30 and 40 minutes, and I think I've heard them all um, at least 3 times. Right. And Peter Adamson is, I just have to sort of take my hat off to the guy. Extraordinary. He irritates me sometimes because he sits on the fence about things and doesn't declare his own hand, especially on things like religion and faith and belief, and whether he thinks a series of ideas are just BS or not. Doesn't say. But it gives you, and it is literally without any gaps. He goes from the pre-Socratic, he goes from the Thales, he goes from acknowledging that even as the pre-Socratics and Socrates and then Aristotle and then Plato, and then bang, you're into like the post-Socratic, and always there's a kind of tangent to this. These ideas were informed by the trade route that links Greece to North Africa and to China, to India in part, and you get this sense. It's not always declared that even when some of his most favourite philosophers, Avicenna, Arabian philosopher, Al-Kindi, these sorts of people, engaging with Aristotle. I mean, sometimes directly through the translation movement. It was a direct. It's not like made up. This is where they've taken translations of Aristotle or Plato, and they rework them according to their own lights, their own culture, their own understanding. But what you see is a cross-fertilisation of ideas, though Peter Adamson doesn't spend too much time on that bit, the cross-fertilization. You have to do a bit of work yourself. But what he does do is he lays out that all these things are happening roughly around about the same time. You know, what's happening in China, what's happening in Arabia, what's happening in Africa. The African experience is very clear about it's not Africa. There's no kind of oversight orthodoxy that comes out of Africa. It's hugely diverse, but there is a kind of, if you will, if you need to do this, and I kind of like to do this because I'm pretty stupid. You need to understand the difference. Is the African account of philosophy is much more oral, and it's much more to do with body and group and expressing it through conversations and through music and through dance, which is a fascinating way of looking at how your cosmology, your views of where you stand in the universe, and your philosophies come from, right? And one of my claims in all of this is that we are not, we, all white guys, need to show a little bit of humility, and also, I think, to acknowledge our part in what has been a biased, one-sided account of the human experience thus far, particularly in the West, without becoming all kind of so relativist that there's nothing that you can derive from it because it's just so complex and so varied. I think there is. I think there is scope for what I'm calling a new enlightenment, which doesn't just seek to synthesize. I don't always think there is the possibility of a synthesis, but I think there is the possibility of a combination, which is not the same. It's not like a dialectical process of taking one or two things, squeezing them together to produce a third thing. I'm talking about the coexistence, the plurality of ideas, where you can look at one thing from the vantage point of science, you can look at the same thing from the vantage point of poetry, and you look at the same thing from the vantage point of cultural shared ideas, from art, from music, from dance. And take something like the importance of music across all cultures. Okay, where does music appear in the analytical tradition of philosophy? Nowhere. Why not? Because it's not subject to the reductive analytical. There's no syllogism that explains musical theory. There's no kind of like inductive or deductive process that can be derive some higher meaning from music. But I think there is an account of the human condition, especially around things of consciousness and shared consciousness, where art, culture, poetry, and music need to come into the reckoning. Anyway, there you have it. A list of go-to people that I rely on, that shape my own views and ideas. I've tried to avoid a hierarchy of those. The list of people that have influenced and shaped is at least 3 times the size of the ones that I've identified. There's a huge amount of people like Lacan and like Habermas and like Franz Kafka and Simone de Beauvoir, and one more who's been absolutely key is Raymond Tallis. And I've spoken to Ray by email. He's very, very, very generously come back to me. Ray Tallis has done this brilliant thing in looking at the huge importance of the scientific method without being mystified by it or sidetracked by it or allowing it to distort his rigorous and analytical view. And he wrote several books that I've bought and admire, but the takeaway for him is his approach to consciousness. And he's a trained doctor, and I think he worked a lot on brain damage issues and dementia, Alzheimer's, uh, stroke victims, I think. But he's a hugely competent, highly professional doctor, but he's also a philosopher, and uh, he is highly critical of the inappropriate use of the scientific method. And I don't think he's done it directly. I can't remember. But he would, if you were wondering about how brilliant, or you thought how brilliant Jordan Peterson was, say for example, go to go, go to Ray Tallis. He's your antidote. He's like, you've supped something, you thought it was good for you, you start to feel a bit nauseous afterwards. Go to Ray Tallis. He's brilliant. He's a really good talker. He's on YouTube. He's on all over social media. He's knocking on a bit, and he's my sort of age. Might even be slightly older. He's brilliant. Um, so I didn't want to not mention Ray Tallis. His go-to book is called Darwinism and Aping Mankind, and he looks at the thing that I am intrigued by and puzzled by, but how we got to where we are. And he looks at the opposable thumbs. He looks at gesture and pointing. He looks at how consciousness arises from the lived experience. He's just outstanding. So Peter Adamson, covering our whole history of philosophy cross-culturally. Ray Tallis, looking at the application of the scientific method, but its appropriate use in terms of trying to understand things which are yet almost inexplicable, like the nature of consciousness, which I don't think there's going to ever be an answer to myself, simply because we're caught in this bind of it being with both the subject and the object of our inquiry, this sort of self-referential thing. I think it's almost impossible to get out of. It's like the Heisenberg principle of not being able to measure where a particle is and how fast it's moving at the same time. I think that's it. Heisenberg uncertainty principle, or what's the maths one, where the mathematical method itself can't understand some of the formulas that maths produces because it relies on maths to answer it. And this is also a problem I have with empiricism. The problem of induction, if you like, is that you need experience to critique the results of experience. And I don't think you can do it because it becomes a kind of self-reinforcing circular argument. So I don't think we have to close the door on the investigation of consciousness. I just don't think we're ever going to get to a final, that's it, done and dusted, put it away, don't worry about it position. We're going to get ever closer. I think that is the nature of the scientific method, that we never resolve anything. We just get better and better explanations of things. Thanks David Deutsch and Karl Popper for that insight. It's really, really important because it gets away from all the other BS to do with purpose, truth, and is there some divine purpose behind our journey? I don't think there is. So there you go. That's my set out of go-to people that I'm going to attack, critique, deconstruct, and the massive pool of ideas, information, insights, knowledge, experience, and wisdom that I'm drawing on in my, feeble, hopefully humble, excitable way to try and generate a discussion around all these issues that underpin our current malaise, our current lack of self-confidence, self-awareness, and lack of certainty about the options going forward. There you go, beyond reason.